The story of this individual is truly shocking. A vicious and calculated serial killer turned influencer and YouTuber, confessing to over 60+ murders and feared throughout Brazil. Some crimes are unbelievably gruesome. Was this man nothing more than a bloodthirsty monster, or is there something deeper beneath the surface? How was he able to transition from serial murderer to a successful YouTuber? Let's explore the life of Pedrinho Matador, little Pedro the killer, to find out. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's story begins on October 17, 1954, in the small town of Santa Rita do Sapucaí, Minas Gerais, Brazil. Pedro was literally shaped by brutality. His mother, pregnant with him, was mercilessly beaten by his father, a man whose violent temper was infamous throughout their neighborhood. The blow was so vicious that Pedro was born with a permanent dent in his skull, a physical scar of abuse sustained before he even drew his first breath. Doctors who examined Pedro after birth noted this indentation with concern. Years later, psychologists would analyze his brain scans and speculate that this prenatal trauma may have permanently damaged key regions responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, and empathy. Some neurologists and early childhood experts argue that such early injuries and childhood trauma can alter a child's ability to process emotions properly, which may partially explain Pedro's later inability to feel remorse or inhibit violent impulses. Yet biology alone cannot explain what comes next. Pedro's environment was as brutal as the injury he carried. Born into grinding poverty, his family lived on the fringes of society, in a town riddled with corruption, crime, and a sense of lawlessness that permeated everyday life. The local police were often complicit in crimes, or simply indifferent, offering no protection or justice to the vulnerable. To survive in this world, one had to be ruthless or be crushed. Inside the Rodrigues household, violence was routine. Pedro's father was a tyrant, a man who ruled his family through fear, intimidation, and physical abuse. His mother bore the brunt of his wrath silently, suffering countless beatings with no one to turn to for help. Pedro grew up watching this cycle of cruelty, absorbing it like a dark lesson etched into his psyche. There were no lullabies or comforting embraces, only the steady drumbeat of fists against flesh and walls. From an early age, Pedro exhibited troubling behaviors. As a child, he was prone to sudden outbursts of uncontrollable rage. He showed little empathy for others, animals, peers, even his own family. Teachers would recall him as a withdrawn boy with an unsettling calmness masking a storm just beneath the surface. He was quick to anger, slow to forgive, and unnervingly methodical in his aggression. In an era and place where mental health support was non-existent, Pedro's early warning signs were ignored or misunderstood. No social workers intervened, no psychologists diagnosed, no counselors tried to help. In this vacuum, the seeds of his violent future were allowed to take root. His childhood was a crucible of suffering and neglect, each blow from his father another strike against a fragile humanity. It was a world where survival depended on toughness, where weakness meant death, or worse, endless suffering. Pedro's life trajectory was shaped by a relentless cascade of trauma, and the result was a boy becoming a killer. By the time Pedro Rodrigues Filho was 13 years old, he had already endured a childhood few could survive without scars, both physical and psychological. But while many children at that age were learning to navigate school and friendships, Pedro's life took a dark, irreversible turn. At 13, he committed his first known murder, setting the stage for a violent career that would horrify Brazil and the world. The trigger was intensely personal. Pedro's father, a school security guard, was accused of theft, stealing food meant for children at the school where he worked. The accusation came from the town's vice mayor, who wielded his power without mercy, firing Pedro's father and publicly shaming the family. In Pedro's eyes, the vice mayor was not simply an official doing his job, he was a man who had attacked Pedro's family's dignity, pushing them deeper into poverty and despair. For Pedro, such an insult demanded retribution, so he acquired a shotgun, a weapon far beyond what a typical child would have access to. Some say he stole it, others say he found it it abandoned in the streets. Whatever the case, with that gun, Pedro confronted the vice mayor. The shot was fired, and the vice mayor died. It was more than a crime. It was a declaration. Pedro was no longer a frightened boy. He was a predator who had tasted the power of life and death. But the bloodlust didn't end there. Not long after, Pedro located the actual thief, the person he believed had truly committed the theft that got his father fired. This man, another school employee, was also killed by Pedro. This pattern of violent retribution reveals a disturbing moral code. Pedro believed he was exacting justice. He was judge, jury, and executioner. He rationalized murder as necessary to right wrongs that the legal system ignored or failed to punish. Pedro had become a terrifying teenager. How could a child commit such calculated acts? How could someone so young wield such power and lack remorse? Experts suggest that Pedro's brain injury, combined with his traumatic upbringing, created a perfect storm of aggression and emotional detachment. Without empathy or fear, he saw the world in black and white. Those who hurt his family deserved to die.
This was not a momentary lapse or impulsive rage. This was a chilling glimpse into a mind already set on violence. The community reacted with shock and horror. But the boy who killed a town official at 13 was not a fleeting news story. He was the beginning of a long, bloody legacy that would stretch for decades. After the first two killings that marked his entry into the world of murder, Pedro Rodriguez Filho didn't hide in the shadows or disappear from the world. Instead, he seemed to embrace his new identity, a self-styled arbiter of justice operating outside the law. Fleeing his small hometown where he had made too much noise, Pedro moved to the sprawling metropolis of Sao Paulo, a city pulsing with life but riddled with corruption, inequality, and rampant crime. It was the perfect hunting ground for a young man driven by a mix of rage, trauma, and a warped sense of justice. Pedro's mission was clear: to hunt down and eliminate the criminals who preyed on the weak and oppressed. Drug dealers, pimps, extortionists, thieves, anyone he considered evil was a target. But this was no haphazard spree. Pedro was calculating, patient, and ruthless. In a way, it was evil hunting evil. He didn't join gangs or work for any criminal organizations. Instead, he operated as a lone wolf, a shadow stalking the underworld. He ingratiated himself with his targets, gaining their trust, sometimes even befriending them, only to strike when they least expected it. The method was simple. Pedro would watch and learn their routines, discover their weaknesses, and choose the moment to kill with surgical precision. His victims were not random. Pedro claimed he only killed those who had committed heinous crimes. In his mind, he was delivering the justice the police refused to administer. Some in the criminal world saw him as a myth, leaving death in his wake. Others called him a monster, but Pedro didn't care what they thought. He felt justified. By the time he was 18 years old, Pedro's body count reportedly reached over a dozen. He earned the nickname Pedrinho Matador, Little Pedro, the killer. His reputation grew in the underworld. Some criminals lived in fear, others were curious. But one thing was certain: Pedro had tasted blood, and he wanted more. Psychologists studying his behavior suggest that Pedro's combination of early trauma, brain injury, and social environment shaped a man who lacked the normal inhibitions most people have against killing. He seemed to be driven by a sense of mission, but that mission was tinged with rage and a deep-seated need for control. In many ways, Pedro represented a dark mirror of society's failure. When institutions break down and justice becomes a joke, individuals like Pedro emerge. Sao Paulo in the early 1970s was a city of stark contrast. Gleaming skyscrapers and luxury neighborhoods stood side by side with sprawling favelas, rife with poverty, crime, and desperation. It was a melting pot of social tensions, political unrest, and the shadows of a military dictatorship. For a young man like Pedro Rodriguez Filho, it was an environment ripe for violence, and he wasted no time plunging headfirst into its underworld. Rather than hide from the law or the dangers of the streets, Pedro immersed himself deeper in the criminal world. His reputation as a cold-blooded killer spread quickly, and he became known as
Pedrinho Matador, a teenage executioner who dispensed his own brutal form of justice. Pedro's killings during this time were marked by increasing brutality and calculation. He targeted drug dealers who exploited vulnerable addicts, pimps who trafficked young girls, corrupt officials who abused their power, and criminals who preyed on the innocent. Each murder was carefully planned and executed with chilling precision. But what set Pedro apart from many other killers was not just his body count, it was his selective targeting. Unlike indiscriminate killers, Pedro operated according to his own twisted moral code. He believed that by removing these bad people, he was cleansing society of its worst elements. This sense of righteousness fueled his violence, giving him purpose in a world he saw as corrupt and broken. Pedro's ability to infiltrate criminal circles allowed him to gather intelligence, gain trust, and then strike when his victims were most vulnerable. Some survivors described him as charismatic and convincing, able to slip in unnoticed before unleashing deadly force. His youth only added to the unpredictability, making him a terrifying enigma. But the killings also took a toll on Pedro himself. Behind the mask of the fearless killer was a young man haunted by loss and rage. His girlfriend, Maria Aparecida Olympia, the cousin of a local drug dealer, was murdered under suspicious circumstances, likely a hit by a rival gang. Her death shattered Pedro's fragile attempts at normalcy and plunged him into a relentless cycle of vengeance. In the aftermath, Pedro reportedly wiped out entire gangs linked to her murder, escalating the violence to unprecedented levels. Witnesses spoke of his cold demeanor, methodical planning, and the absolute finality of his executions. Law enforcement struggled to capture Pedro. His movements were unpredictable, and his reputation for violence made many too afraid to testify. By 1973, at the age of 19, the police finally apprehended him, bringing an end to his teenage reign of terror. Yet even in custody, Pedro remained an enigma, calm, unrepentant, and seemingly unaffected by the gravity of his crimes.
Pedro's story during these years paints a portrait of a young man who saw himself as both executioner and avenger, trapped in a city and a society that had failed him at every turn. If you're enjoying this video, please like and subscribe for more. When Pedro Rodrigues Filho was finally apprehended in 1973, the world was only beginning to grasp the scale of his crimes. At just 19 years old, Pedro's name was already infamous, whispered in fear across Sao Paulo's criminal underworld, and muttered with disgust among the police force. But capturing him did not mean containing the monster within. The moment of his arrest marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that would unfold behind the iron bars of Brazil's notoriously brutal prison system. Pedro's first trip to prison revealed how dangerous and resourceful he truly was. During transport to the facility, authorities placed Pedro in the back of a police van alongside another suspect. By the time the vehicle arrived at the station, the other man was dead, stabbed repeatedly with a weapon Pedro had ingeniously concealed on his person. When questioned about the murder, Pedro's chilling explanation was simple. The victim was a rapist. In his mind, justice had been served once again, this time within the confines of the lawless prison transport. Inside the prison walls, Pedro did not fade into obscurity. Instead, he thrived. Brazilian prisons in the 1970s were infamous for their overcrowding, squalid conditions, and rampant violence. They were battlegrounds where only the strongest survived, and Pedro quickly asserted himself at the top of the food chain. He refused to align himself with any of the established gangs, choosing instead to walk a solitary path marked by fear and intimidation. Pedro was not interested in alliances or friendships. His survival depended on one thing alone: control. Stories spread throughout the prison about his ruthlessness. Guards and inmates alike feared crossing him, and rumors circulated of his brutal killings. Some said he would silently observe his targets for weeks, learning their habits before striking with deadly precision. Pedro's reputation as prisoner number one, the most feared inmate in the system, was well earned. He was not just a killer, he was a predator who thrived in the chaos of prison life. His behavior inside prison demonstrated an almost clinical detachment. He was calm, composed, and methodical. Many psychologists who studied him later noted that Pedro appeared to be in complete control of his actions, capable of calculating his moves with frightening clarity. This was not the mind of a reckless youth. It was the mind of a killer who had fully embraced his role. Over the years, Pedro's time behind bars would be marked by a series of grisly murders, a testament to his belief that some people were beyond redemption and deserved only death. Pedro Rodriguez Filho's reign of terror did not end when he was locked behind bars. It only intensified. Brazil's prison system during the 1970s and 80s was one of the most brutal and chaotic in the world. Overcrowded cells, corrupt guards, and rival gangs vying for control created a pressure cooker of violence. It was the perfect environment for Pedro's darkest impulses to flourish. While most inmates struggled to survive, Pedro became something else entirely, a hunter in a cage, preying on those he judged unworthy of life. His victims were not random. He targeted rapists, child molesters, wife beaters, and those he deemed morally corrupt. In his twisted worldview, Pedro was delivering a form of justice that the outside world refused to administer. His methods were as primitive as they were brutal. He fashioned weapons out of whatever he could find: sharpened toothbrushes, broken glass shards, bed-frame metal rods. These crude tools became extensions of his deadly will. Pedro's kills were marked by cold efficiency. He struck in showers, during yard time, even in solitary confinement where few would expect violence. Guards found victims with throats slit, faces smashed, and bodies left in gruesome states. Whispers among inmates told stories that bordered on legend. One tale recounts how Pedro killed 3 men in 3 different prison blocks in a single day, moving unseen like a ghost. It was only hours later that the bodies were discovered. Pedro's killing spree behind bars earned him the nickname the Executioner of Sao Paulo prisons. His ability to kill repeatedly without being caught spoke to a terrifying mastery of his environment and the people around him. The brutality was such that even hardened criminals feared sharing cells with him. Many begged guards to transfer them elsewhere rather than risk crossing paths with Pedro. One of the most chilling stories involves Pedro's claim that he once cut out a man's heart, cooked it, and ate a piece. While the truth of this act remains debated, the symbolism is clear. Pedro was declaring dominance over life and death, mocking the sanctity of his victims. Despite the horror, Pedro often justified his actions with an unshakable conviction. When asked why he was killed inside prison, he said simply, to him, the prisons were cesspools of evil, and he saw himself as a necessary force of cleansing. His murders inside prison exposed the failure of the Brazilian justice system to rehabilitate or contain its most dangerous criminals. Pedro was a living example of how violence begets violence. During his incarceration, Pedro also became a subject of psychological studies. Experts noted his lack of remorse, his calculated brutality, and his deep-seated rage rooted in early childhood trauma. Some called him a psychopath. Others argued he was a product of a broken system. What is certain is that Pedro's legacy behind bars is one of unparalleled bloodshed and terror. A man who killed without hesitation, without mercy, and without regret. Among the many grisly chapters in Pedro Rodriguez Filho's life, one stands out with haunting intensity: the murder of his own father. It is a story that sheds light on the darkest corners of his psyche and the deep personal wounds that fueled his violent crusade. Pedro's father was no stranger to violence himself. A brutal man, he had inflicted unspeakable pain on Pedro's mother, a cycle of abuse that contributed to Pedro's very birth trauma. Years later, his father was convicted of murdering Pedro's mother in a fit of jealous rage. This act not only destroyed their family, but also left Pedro burdened with a profound sense of betrayal and rage. When Pedro learned that his father was incarcerated in the same prison, a place where his own reign of terror was already well established, he requested a meeting. The guards, unaware of the potential consequences, allowed the two to come face to face. What followed was a chilling act of vengeance and symbolism. Pedro stabbed his father 22 times, a brutal and deliberate killing. But he did not stop there. He mutilated the body, cutting out his father's heart, and, according to some reports, took a bite from it. Whether literal or symbolic, this act was a macabre declaration. Pedro was not merely killing a man, he was destroying the embodiment of his childhood torment and pain. This murder was different from all the others. It was deeply personal. It was a ritualistic severing of ties with the past, a moment where Pedro exacted ultimate revenge on the man who had shattered his family and scarred his life. When questioned about the killing, Pedro reportedly told guards, "I killed him with the same rage he used to beat my mother." The murder of
of his own father sent shockwaves throughout the prison system and the wider public. It was a stark reminder that Pedro's violence was not simply the product of criminal impulse, but a manifestation of deep psychological wounds. Followers of Pedro's case see this event as a pivotal moment. It illustrates how his early experiences of abuse and trauma had been internalized and morphed into a relentless cycle of violence. In many ways, Pedro's father's murder symbolizes the destructive legacy of domestic violence, a legacy that consumes not only the immediate victims, but also shapes the lives of future generations. Pedro himself seemed to view the act as both punishment and therapeutic, yet it also marked a dark turning point, confirming his path as a man irrevocably defined by vengeance. Despite the grim reality of Pedro's crimes, Brazil's penal system held limits that would soon alter his fate in unexpected ways. Pedro was sentenced to an astonishing total of 128 years in prison, later extended to an unofficial 400 years.
No matter how many crimes one committed, Brazilian law at the time placed a maximum cap on actual time served, 30 years. This legal ceiling was meant to reflect humanitarian principles, but in Pedro's case, it created a paradoxical outcome. A man who had admitted to killing dozens, including inside prison walls, would eventually be released back into society. In 2003, after serving 3 decades behind bars, Pedro walked free. His release sparked outrage among victims' families, law enforcement, and the general public. How could a man responsible for so much death be allowed to return to the streets? The answer lies in the complexities of Brazil's penal codes and sentencing practices. The cap on time served was designed to prevent life imprisonment, which Brazil did not recognize in the same way many other countries do. The idea was to encourage rehabilitation and reintegration, no matter the severity of the crimes. Pedro's case tested this philosophy to its limits. Following his release, many expected him to return to violence or vanish into the criminal underworld, but Pedro claimed to have changed. He promised to live a lawful life, distancing himself from the past that had defined him. Yet the story did not end there. In 2011, Pedro was arrested again, not for murder, but on charges related to minor offenses, including firearm possession. He spent several years back in prison, but was released once more in 2018. This second release was met with skepticism and fear. Could Pedro truly reform, or was he merely waiting for another chance to unleash violence? Pedro himself embraced a new public persona, one far removed from the shadows of his youth. He began producing videos on YouTube, sharing his experiences, reflections, and advice with a wide audience. To many, this was a surprising transformation, a killer turned social commentator. But questions remained. Was this new Pedro genuine, or was it another form of control, manipulating public perception and wielding influence in a different way? Pedro's releases exposed the tensions in Brazil's justice system between punishment, rehabilitation. His life became a case study in the limits of incarceration and the challenges of reintegrating violent offenders. The story of Pedro's release serves as a sobering reminder. Sometimes, the law's intent and society's demands collide, creating outcomes as complex as the man himself. Following his final release from prison in 2018, Pedro embarked on an unexpected new chapter, one that would shock many who had only known him as Pedrinho Matador, the ruthless killer who ruled both the streets and the prison blocks of Brazil. Now, Pedro chose a different kind of battlefield, the digital world. Launching a YouTube channel under the name Pedrinho X Matador, he began sharing videos that ranged from crime prevention advice to reflections on his own dark past. The transformation was surreal and difficult for many to reconcile. A man who had once reportedly cut out a man's heart and ate some was now speaking directly to young viewers about the dangers of crime and the importance of avoiding violence. His production quality was modest at best. Cheap camera setups, poor lighting, and a spare setting, often just a lawn chair and a bare wall. But Pedro's charisma was undeniable. He spoke with a calm, sometimes chilling composure, recounting stories from his past with vivid detail and a strange mixture of candor and casualness. Pedro did not shy away from the truth. He openly discussed the murders he committed, describing some with a disturbing level of detachment. In one video, he chuckled as he recounted stabbing a man in prison, commenting on how the victim didn't struggle much. To some, this lack of remorse was chilling. To others, it was an honest confession. His channel quickly gained traction, amassing millions of views and attracting a mix of followers, true crime enthusiasts, skeptics, and curious onlookers, drawn to the man who seemed to blur the line between monster and anti-hero.
But Pedro's online presence raised difficult questions. Was this a genuine attempt at rehabilitation, a way for him to educate others by sharing the consequences of violence? Or was it a performance, a new stage on which to command attention and wield influence? Critics accused Pedro of glorifying violence, arguing that his videos could inspire impressionable youth rather than deter them. Supporters contended that his raw honesty provided a rare window into the mind of a killer, serving as a cautionary tale that no textbook or lecture could replicate. Pedro himself appeared to relish the spotlight. His tone was often sarcastic, and at times the mask of the repentant man slipped, revealing glimpses of the cold calculation that had defined much of his life. His YouTube channel became a paradox, both a platform for reflection and a subtle performance of power. The channel also touched on sensitive topics, including corruption within law enforcement, drug cartels, and the brutal realities of prison life. Pedro did not hesitate to call out powerful figures, which may have put him in danger. Ultimately, Pedro's foray into social media highlighted the complexity of his legacy. Here was a man who had lived on both sides of the law, who embodied both evil and survival, cruelty and charisma. His videos sparked debates about redemption, justice, and the possibility of change, even for someone like Pedro Rodriguez Filho. On the afternoon of March 5, 2023, Pedro was standing outside a modest family home in Mogi das Cruzes. The sun cast long shadows, children played nearby, and the usual hum of neighborhood life continued, unaware that one of Brazil's most infamous figures was about to meet a violent end. Pedro was engaged in a casual conversation with a relative, appearing as just another man in a crowd. There was no hint of menace, no sign that the man who had survived decades of violence and imprisonment was about to become a victim himself. Then, without warning, a motorcycle approached. Two men rode up, one driving, the other wielding a .40 caliber pistol. They did not speak, they did not hesitate. The gunfire erupted, echoing through the street. Pedro was struck multiple times, collapsing onto the pavement. His body lay sprawled and motionless, a stark contrast to the fierce survivor who had once navigated the blood-soaked corridors of Brazil's prisons. His death was swift, brutal, and public. A man who had once been the executioner, now executed in plain sight. No group claimed responsibility for the killing, and no arrests were made. The silence surrounding his murder only added to the mystery and speculation. Several theories emerged in the aftermath. One posited that Pedro's past finally caught up with him, that relatives or associates of his numerous victims had waited decades for revenge. In Brazil, where vendettas and cycles of violence often span generations, this theory seemed plausible. Another suggested a contract killing. Pedro's YouTube videos frequently touched on sensitive subjects: corruption, drug cartels, and law enforcement abuses. It's possible someone with power felt threatened by his revelations and paid for his silence. There was also speculation that rising criminal factions wanted to send a message. Killing a figure as notorious as Pedro could be a way to assert dominance and gain respect in the underworld. Or perhaps it was simpler. Pedro may have unknowingly crossed a dangerous line, getting involved with the wrong people in the present day. Whatever the truth, Pedro's death was poetic in its own grim way. He died as many of his victims had, suddenly, violently, and without mercy. His final moments serve as a stark reminder that in the violent world Pedro inhabited, no one truly escapes the consequences of a life stained by blood. Pedro remains one of the most infamous and controversial figures in Brazil's criminal history. His life story, a brutal saga of violence, vengeance, and survival, challenges our understanding of justice, morality, and the human capacity for darkness. He claimed to have only killed bad people, rapists, murderers, corrupt officials, those he deemed beyond redemption. Yet who, in a civilized society, grants any individual the authority to decide who lives or dies?
Pedro's self-appointed role as judge, jury, and executioner blurs the line between vigilante justice and cold-blooded murder. To some, Pedro is a symbol of raw justice in a system riddled with corruption and failure. His fans, often from marginalized communities, see him as a folk hero who took matters into his own hands when no one else would. They point to his brutal honesty and his efforts later in life to warn others about the dangers of crime. But to many others, Pedro is a monster, a chilling example of psychopathy unleashed by a broken society. His acts of violence, both outside and inside prison, demonstrate how trauma and neglect can destroy
distort a human being's soul beyond recognition. Psychologists studying Pedro emphasize the complex interplay between his biology, upbringing, and environment. The prenatal brain injury, his exposure to family violence, and the socio-political chaos of Brazil's 20th century underworld all contributed to molding a man capable of both calculated murder and charismatic storytelling. Pedro's life also forces society to confront uncomfortable questions about punishment and rehabilitation. Despite spending decades behind bars and confessing to dozens of murders, he was ultimately released twice. His story reveals the gaps and contradictions in the criminal justice system, highlighting the challenges of balancing human rights with public safety. His foray into social media adds another layer of complexity. Through his YouTube channel, Pedro transformed from a shadowy killer to a public figure, blurring the boundaries between infamy and influence. His videos spark debates about whether true redemption is possible for someone with his past. He never sought forgiveness. Instead, he seemed to embrace his identity fully, a man shaped by violence, who wielded it as both a weapon and a shield. In the end, Pedro Rodrigues Filho's legacy is a mirror reflecting society's darkest corners, the failures of families, communities, and institutions to protect the vulnerable and prevent cycles of violence. His life is a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that monsters are not born in isolation, but are often created by the world around them. Whether seen as vigilante or villain, legend or lesson, Pedro's story continues to captivate and horrify, challenging us to reckon with the fragile line between justice and vengeance. What do you think of Pedro? Monster who finally got what he deserved, or heroic vigilante on targeting the truly evil? Let me know in the comments.